Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, my thanks to Professor Lane for arranging this day and making it happen. My first time at the War College. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm glad to see all of you turn out for a talk about one of the world's great laid-back regions, the Middle East. Not too much happening. I'll see if I can find something to catch your attention. Israel is actually, at the moment, is caught up, I would say, in one of the worst political crises and the worst constitutional crisis of its history being played out these days. But the good thing about it is it gives me an opportunity to tell you my favorite joke. And it's a story about one of the early elections many years ago during the transition, just like we're in at the moment. The outgoing prime minister is there, but he's about to leave. The new guy hasn't come in yet. And the story is that some guy walks up to the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem, knocks on the front door, and the prime minister's wife answers. And he says, "Hi, I'd like to see the prime minister, please." And she said, "Well, you know, we're in the transition. He's not really prime minister anymore. And in any event, he's not home." The guy says, "Thank you very much," walks away. 15 minutes later, same guy comes back, knocks on the door. "Hi, I'd like to see the prime minister, please." She said, "I told you before, he's not really prime minister anymore. And in any event, he's not home." "Thank you very much." 15 minutes later, the same guy comes, knocks on the door. "Hi, I'd like to see the prime minister, please." She said, "Tell me, what are you, stupid? Don't you understand? He's not the prime minister anymore." He said, "I understand. It's just so good to hear it." No names. We're in a military institution, nonpartisan. But the great thing about that is we get to tell jokes like that. How many people here have been in Israel, if I can ask? Okay. So most of you know. I'd like just to touch. Anyway, so everybody knows that Israel's a small country. But anybody know the dimensions? How long is Israel? 300 miles, right. And how wide? What's the widest? About 80 miles. Near Beersheba is the widest. And it would be really good if I had the map now, but what's the narrowest? 9. Well, that's what people say. It's actually a bold lie because it's only 8.7. And a third of a mile is significant when the whole thing is 9 miles. But that's not even true, because what you're talking about is just north of Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is about 12 miles. So that's the center of the country. It's known as Israel's narrow waist. But is that the narrowest? No. Think of the... Okay, you've got what's known as the Finger of the Galilee, where it's about... Yes. We have what's called the Finger of the Galilee. You see that little piece up in the north where it's about 5 miles. But that's not the narrowest either. So take a look. Where's the narrowest? Down in the bottom, Eilat, Aqaba on the Jordanian side, where in the end the V comes down to a few hundred yards. That's the whole thing. And so to understand Israeli national security thinking, first of all, starts with geography. And to talk to a predominantly American audience, a continental-sized country, let's put things in perspective, right? Of course, this is without Alaska. And I used to say that Israel is so small you could put it in one of the Great Lakes and it would sink and nobody would even know. And okay, somebody else has got a sense of humor almost as warped as my own, right? This is scale. So it's tiny. Israel is about, let's see, I'm thinking in kilometers, it's about 20,000, but I've got it in miles. It's 8,100 square miles. It's about the size of New Jersey and about the same population size. Now, Israel and the West Bank together are 46 miles wide together. Okay? It's barely enough for one country, and we have to divide it if we want to reach a peace agreement for 2. And Gaza is 8 by 20. The Golan Heights, which I think some people, when they hear the Golan Heights, they think of something which is the Himalayas. It's 12 by 43. And look at, you see the narrow, the elongated geography. Now, the West Bank is a hilly area, not quite mountainous, hilly, which overlooks all of central Israel. And really, everything that makes Israel a country just about is located from Ashkelon up to, let's say, Haifa, or if you want, Beersheba to Haifa. But from Ashkelon to Haifa is 70% of the population, 80% of the industrial base, and it's all right there in what's called the coastal plain. And from the hilly West Bank, it's all there to the naked eye. And if you walk up to the borderline, you're now in rock distance. The Golan Heights, as the name suggests, really is a high area. So geography or topography is critical to everything that has to do with Israeli national security thinking. The population, I said today, is about 9 million people, of whom 7 million are Jews, and most people don't know 2 million, 20% of Israel's population are non-Jews, mostly Muslims. Now, there were a number of fundamental asymmetries, which are still true, but they're true in a different way from the way they were in Israel's early years. So I said Israel's population is 9 million. The Arab countries today are about 350 million. If you add Turkey and Iran, it's about 500 million. The broader Muslim world, now this is far from being monolithic, don't misunderstand me today. But if you look at the fundamental populations that you can draw on, there is, of course, a huge difference. And the huge difference in geography. Okay, we're not doing, oh, okay, there we go. All right, so that's Israel compared to the Arab world, not including Iran and Turkey, and just Egypt. So enormous territorial asymmetry. Obviously, there's a huge difference in economic resources, what the Arab world could bring to bear, what Israel could bring to bear, and especially the Arab world with the oil-producing nations. And there was a fundamental asymmetry in terms of military aims. Israel's maximum geographic demands are West Bank and Golan Heights, and of course much of Israel would like to reach a territorial compromise on the West Bank. But that's Israel's maximum. Those areas were the minimum Arab war objectives. The maximum, of course, was, some would argue today still is, all of Israel. Israel couldn't win the wars in a strategic sense because the Arab countries, again, I'm generalizing, there was the famous 3 no's of Khartoum of 1968, no recognition, no negotiations, no peace, because the Arab world refused for decades, and of course today Egypt and Jordan is different, refused to have anything to do with Israel. Israel won most of the wars, maybe in an operational sense, and I would say won the peace with Jordan and Egypt, who made peace with Israel not out of love for Israel, not because they really wanted to make peace with Israel so much, I believe, but because they wanted to end the wars. So Israel won the wars themselves. It was never able to dictate the terms of the peace, as other countries have done. And Israel, over the years, put forward, it's been a while, but put forward some dramatic peace proposals at Camp David, agreeing to the Clinton parameters in 2000, the Olmert proposal of 2008. In effect, other than the so-called right of return, the return of refugees, there was really no more that Israel could have proposed. A Palestinian state on virtually 100% of the territory, division of Jerusalem, division of sovereignty over the holy sites. The only issue in which Israel actually didn't put pretty much everything on the table was the right of return, and that wasn't enough to reach a peace proposal also. So there are some strange processes at work here in the Arab-Israeli conflict. When the wars don't bring you the peace doesn't bring you the peace. Well, the good news from Israel's point of view is that these asymmetries, they're true and they're not true. The territorial asymmetry, of course, is true. The population asymmetry is true. But the Arab world was never able to act in an organized fashion, in a united coalition. Had they been able to, Israel never would have won the wars, never would have survived. Even in 1948, Israel's War of Independence, Israel had the strategic luxury, if you will, of fighting on each of the fronts consecutively because of Arab disarray. Had the Arab side been organized and attacked at the same time, Israel never would have survived. Now, to understand, again, Israeli national security thinking, it starts with a word which is used in Israel, I believe, more than in any other country in the world, and that is the word existential. Okay? Everything is viewed as existential. We overuse it. Certainly, for the last couple of decades, we greatly overuse it. I don't believe that there is an existential threat today. And personally, I think that even if Iran goes nuclear, and we have to do everything possible to prevent that from happening, even then, Israel can handle it. It has strategic capabilities of its own, and I believe it can handle that. But everything is viewed in an existential perspective. Now, lots of countries have experienced politicide, destruction of the state. The Nazis overrun Europe in World War II. France, the government, it's a puppet government, or Norway, Belgium, Holland. The governments are replaced, or partly replaced. The state continues to exist. The people continue to exist. Israel's fear wasn't always politicide, it was absolute genocide. And if you look at the map again, one of Israel's problems is because it's so small and because it's so narrow, not only was there no room for strategic withdrawal as a military option, there was never any potential even for tactical withdrawal. Because the assumption was if you pulled back even a kilometer from the border, any local population there would be wiped out. So that Israel could never cede even an inch of territory. So it's all about existentialism. A second factor is the extreme uncertainty of the Middle Eastern environment. The Middle East is constantly changing at this frenetic pace. The rapidity of change, the breadth of change, the intensiveness of change. Hardly a day goes by without something happening. I think in Israel we use up more news in a day than most countries use up in a year or in a decade. That makes it extraordinarily hard to do effective decision making. Put aside everything else, the difficulty of the strategic issues, the politics involved, but just the simple rapidity of change, it's living in a state of perpetual crisis. Now, Washington is known to be a one-horse town or a one-crisis town, and the United States is a global superpower. Well, Israel's a very, very small country. All right, it doesn't have to deal with the whole global arena. But the rate of change, one of the problems that the Israeli decision-making process faces is simply people can't keep up with it. By the time you think you're beginning to understand one issue, you're 10 crises down the line. And, okay, so Israel is a tiny nation. It faces the entire gamut of threats, everything. It starts from the most primitive, throwing rocks. Rocks can be lethal. And we've seen for the last couple of years the balloons and the so-called flaming kites, attack kites, coming out of Gaza. I mean, this is as primitive as it gets, right? Using the wind to carry a balloon or to throw a rock. That's biblical already. But it goes all the way up, or it goes up, let's say, to, if I can call it, standard terrorism, and up a notch to a new and extraordinarily form of terrorism, the rocket capabilities that Hezbollah and Hamas have got. And this is actually a little bit outdated because Hezbollah today can cover pretty much every inch of Israeli territory. The working figure is something like 130,000 rockets. No one knows exactly. It's all intelligence estimates, but that's the ballpark figure that people use. And Hamas can cover pretty much all of Israel today as well. So again, starting with rocks and kites and going up to standard terrorism and to this really effective form of terrorism, going up another notch to conventional warfare, well, that's receded in the Mideast, and maybe not just in the Mideast. The old clashing militaries, armies in the field, that seems to no longer be the case. But you still have to prepare for it, because it could happen. And going up a notch to non-conventional threats, and the ultimate threat of nuclear terrorism. Well, here there's a little bit of good news, is that the Syrian chemical arsenal has been mostly, not entirely, but let's say greatly reduced in size. Iraq, of course, no longer has any NBC programs. And the Iranian program has, let's say, been postponed. Don't know for how long, but it's been postponed. And of course, that can change very rapidly where we are today. Another major threat that Israel faces today is the threat of cyber. And it's actually one of the countries most, or under greatest attack in the world in terms of the number of attacks per day. And Israel has developed a really effective, I would say, disproportionate capability in this area. But I would like to do something which is almost unprecedented in the annals of Israeli national security thinking and discourse, and say something actually optimistic and positive. Because I think Israel just celebrated its 71st anniversary a few months ago. And I think Israel is today a vibrant democracy, it's got a vibrant, strong economy. I would say it's today a fundamentally secure state. Now, when I say fundamentally secure and you put it in Israeli terms, most countries would say, my God, we don't want this. This is a catastrophe. Hezbollah, Hamas, Iran, Syria, Turkey, everything. But no one can destroy the state of Israel anymore. Now, in any other country, you say that, so people say, okay, big deal. What's the news? Well, for Israel, I think that is a phenomenal achievement. Israel's national security strategy, for all of the problems, and we'll talk about some of them, overall, the national security strategy has been, I believe, an overwhelming success. Okay? Israel exists today. That was far from a given in the early decades when there really was an existential threat. And I don't believe that that anyone can destroy the state of Israel today. Not Iran, not anyone. That doesn't mean they can't give us a lot of trouble. And Hamas and Hezbollah are doing it now. But they can't destroy Israel anymore. And the national security strategy has allowed Israel to become a prosperous, stable country. And I would say Israel's strategic environment, for the most part, has been transformed for the better. The Arab states have been greatly weakened. As a matter of fact, who could have ever imagined that someone would say this? The biggest threat, I think, that the Arab states present to Israel today isn't their strength, it's their weakness. It's the fact that some of them came apart. Some are still in danger of that happening. It's the weakness today which is the biggest problem. It's projecting on Israel. Most of the Arab countries have given up on any practical aspiration of destroying Israel today. Some still talk, the Syrians, some of the others still talk about it, but none of the Arab countries are really trying to destroy Israel anymore. Egypt and Jordan, of course, made peace with Israel. There are a whole number of countries, the Gulf countries, maybe Tunisia, Morocco, who are just waiting, not even for peace with the Palestinians, but for some sort of breakthrough to formalize what are already expanding de facto relations. The Syrian and Iraqi armies, which were the two threats that the IDF was built to deal with for decades, the primary threats, have been decimated and no longer pose a military threat of significance to Israel. With the exception of Iran, and this is a very big exception, the interstate stage of the Arab-Israeli conflict seems to be over. And today, the conflict is with Iran, but it is with Hezbollah and Hamas, and some smaller Palestinian organizations with non-state actors. Israel enjoys, of course, a phenomenal relationship with the United States. If you can have only one really good friend in the world, and it happens to be the United States, then you're already doing pretty well. There's no hostile superpower anymore. Russia is, I mean, some of its policies are very, very problematic from an Israeli point of view. But they're not directed at Israel. They don't reflect hostility to Israel. Actually, the bilateral relationship is good. They reflect Russian interests. And Israel has relations with more countries in the world today than ever before. For all of the problems of BDS, of delegitimization, of all the problems we all read about, Israel has relations with more countries than ever, including many of the Gulf and other Sunni states, and a number of African and Latin American countries that reestablished relations. The nature of the military threat has been transformed. I already said I don't think there's a conventional threat anymore of significance, and I don't think there's an existential threat anymore. The problem is asymmetric warfare, and asymmetric warfare is a problem. So that's the good news. The bad news is that Israel's enemies, first and foremost Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, understand correctly, they came to this understanding about 20 years ago, that it is Israel's home front which is its weak point, its Achilles heel. And pretty much everything that they've been doing for the last couple of decades is focused on the home front. Now, if and when the next round with Hezbollah happens, personally I'd rather be in Tel Aviv than Beirut, but it's going to be very, very ugly on both sides. Israel will be hit in a way that we have never been hit. The home front is going to be bracketed. To overstate the case, I think Hezbollah's got a rocket for every apartment building in the state of Israel, and I'm sure there's one for my building. Paranoia is a good thing sometimes. And even with Hamas, which is a much, much smaller threat, maybe a lousy 20,000 rockets. Well, I used to think that 20,000 was a lot of rockets also. And of course, in addition to building up the Hezbollah capability, which Iran did as a deterrent towards Israel, so that if and when Israel or the United States ever wanted to attack the nuclear program, they have a huge capability for hitting Israel right from our border. And the biggest threat today isn't just the numbers. It's not the 130,000 rockets. It's the fact that they are trying to develop a precise capability. So far, for the most part, we've managed to interdict this and prevent this in Syria and Iraq, everywhere, all the things you've read about. But if you're 95% effective, I'm making up a number, that still means that 5% gets through. And over time, so today, according to press reporting, Israel thinks that they have a couple of tens of precise rockets or missiles, and in a year or two or 3 or 5, it'll be a couple of 100 if we can't prevent it. And if they hit the primary power plant in Hadera, they black out or brown out a significant portion of the state of Israel. And it's not just the state of Israel, it's not just the civilian sector, and how do you run a high-tech society without electricity, but of course the military depends on the civilian infrastructure for their electricity and water and everything else. Hezbollah today is the first actor in the history of the conflict with the capability not to just disrupt offensive IDF operations, but even to disrupt the mobilization. If they hit mobilization centers, if they hit, of course, air bases, and that's already the offensive capabilities, but that'll be one of the first targets. Okay, Israel's developed a nice defensive capability through Iron Dome, but it doesn't have enough interceptors for all of the incoming rockets. That's out of choice to put most of the money in offensive capabilities. It's going to be ugly. And this is, of course, without taking into account the Iranian nuclear program. And I believe that the Iranians agreed to postpone their capability. They never agreed to give it up. And of course, who knows what they're doing that we don't know about. And in the end, of course, that's also directed at the home front. What makes Iran most dangerous from my perspective is that I think that they are the smartest or the most sophisticated adversary we've ever faced. Some of us look at them, or maybe some people think that the Iranians are loonies. They're not. They're extremists. They're anything but loonies. They are very carefully thinking, very calculated player. The objectives may be extreme, but they go about trying to achieve it in a very carefully calculated way. And Iran may be the first adversary that Israel's ever faced, which is too big, too far away, and too sophisticated to be defeated. Iran as a whole is beyond Israeli capabilities. Now, that doesn't mean I don't sleep well at night. I think we can defend ourselves very well. And I'm not really afraid. But I don't think we can defeat Iran. That's a big difference. If necessary, I think Israel can and must go and attack the nuclear program if and when it's literally the last moment. I don't think Israel can allow Iran to go nuclear. But that's a pinpointed operation. That's X number of targets. It's not a very big X. If Israel does it. If the United States does it, it'll do a bigger operation. The U.S. thinks bigger. That's not an ability to defeat Iran, to take Iran on. That's a capability to hit a very, very specific number of sites. There's another problem which is completely non-military, and from my point of view, it's actually the biggest threat that the state of Israel faces. And that's the fact that we may be reaching a tipping point at which a two-state solution no longer becomes possible. Because the number of settlers in the West Bank, and it's not the settlers themselves, it's the fact that it's them plus all their friends, their relatives, their political supporters on the other side of the border. That's not a few 100,000, that's a few million who say no. And here I think Israel's policy has been extraordinarily self-defeating, but that's a normative or a political position. But if we can't reach a two-state solution, that has profound ramifications for Israel's future as a predominantly Jewish and democratic state. And so I think that's the number one issue. It's not entirely up to us. I said before, Israel's put some dramatic proposals for peace on the table. There isn't much more it could possibly offer. So I don't think we have a partner for the foreseeable future. I think if Israel put 100% of Palestinian demands on the table tomorrow, there's no one on the Palestinian side capable of picking up the ball. So my conclusion is what Israel should be doing, or more importantly not doing, is not creating facts on the ground that make it harder to reach a two-state solution sometime in the future if and when it becomes possible. The utility of force for Israel, and maybe interestingly for the United States as well, maybe the same holds true for a global superpower and a regional power. The utility of force is diminishing. Maybe we're reaching the limits of military force. Now, don't misunderstand me, military force is essential to Israeli national security. It's the fundamental basis for Israel's existence. We don't live in a nice area or in a friendly area. And without military power, military security, Israel doesn't exist. But we can't solve any of the major problems that we face today militarily. You can't destroy Palestinian nationalism militarily. Can't be done. We can postpone if necessary. I mean, I hope we don't reach it. We could probably postpone the Iranian nuclear program. We can't bomb their nuclear knowledge out of existence. Because even if you can destroy all the facilities, a big question mark, but let's say you can, they've got the scientists, they've got the know-how. We can delay Iranian attempts to set up base in Syria and to set up missile sites in Iraq and in Syria and who knows where. We can't prevent it ultimately. It's a losing game. So I don't think there's a military solution to any of the major challenges that Israel faces today. And the even worse news is that there may not be a political solution either. I wrote this book about Israeli national security, and I think maybe one of the most important conclusion, not recommendation, but conclusion, was that Israel has never been more militarily stronger and secure militarily than it is today. And I think that that gives us an opportunity to make some national decisions from a position of strength. And there's still maybe a window of a few years in which we can do that. But things are changing for the worse in the region. I mean, just look what's happening in Syria. Sooner or later, Iran will really renew the nuclear program. They've been slowly, step by step, disengaging from the JCPOA, from the nuclear deal. But at least based on open reporting, they haven't yet actually renewed the really bad stuff. I think that that'll probably happen pretty soon. A few months, half year. But at the moment, there still is this window for Israel to make some big decisions on its own. One of the conclusions, of course, is what I said before. Well, it would be nice if we could reach a peace agreement with the Palestinians, and I would try, and I would put everything that Israel is willing to put on the table again, to try again and to keep trying. I don't believe we can go very far for the meantime, but it's important to try. Maybe, hopefully I'm wrong. But from a more military perspective, one of the major conclusions that I reached, and let me emphasize, I'm talking here not a 180 change, I'm talking a change of a few degrees. I think Israel can and should put more emphasis on deterrence, defense, and diplomacy. Deterrence is hard to achieve. Deterrence is elusive when you're dealing with non-state actors. It's hard with state actors. It's really hard with non-state actors. When I say defense, I'm talking primarily air defense systems. So we've got Iron Dome, David Sling, the Arrow, anti-ballistic missile system. But Israel intentionally made a decision not to invest in all the number of interceptors you would need for all the potential incoming projectiles, because this is unbelievably expensive. I think Israel has to basically swallow the bullet and develop a national defense shield. And I'm happy to say, totally unrelated to my recommendation, Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to have reached a similar conclusion, and he came out with a plan a few weeks ago. He's actually been talking about it for a year or so already, to put another few $1 billion into, a good few billion into air defense. For Israel, billions, a few billion is a lot of money. And it's a price that I think we can pay. We have to, if necessary. If I would impose the I would call it the Iron Dome tax, and make it maybe the first tax in the history of the country that people would actually be happy to pay.